He was the Alpha King of Ashenmoor, the most feared sovereign in 7 kingdoms, a man whose name silenced war councils and made hardened generals lower their eyes. She was an Omega debt slave, invisible as smoke, scrubbing the stones of his great hall, while the court walked past her like she wasn't there. For 3 years, he believed the woman beside him, beautiful, poised, perfectly ruthless, was everything a queen should be. But blood has a way of telling the truth that words never can. When she bled on his floor, everything he thought he knew about himself cracked open, and the kingdom had never, in 300 years of recorded history, seen an Alpha King on his knees. This is her story. The rushes on the floor of the great hall smelled of mildew and old grease, and Sela had learned to breathe through her mouth. It was the only mercy in the hour before dawn, when the hall was empty and the torches burned low, and she could scrub in peace without anyone looking at her, without anyone reminding her what she was. She pressed the brush into a joint between 2 flagstones, working the black mould from the crack, with the patience of someone who had long since stopped counting the days. Her knees ached. Her fingers had bled so often in the first year that the skin had simply stopped opening. It had grown thick and pale at the knuckles, toughened by cold water and caustic soap. She was 20 years old, and she had been property of the Ashenmoor court since she was 17. The debt was her father's. It always was. A loan taken in desperation, a harvest that never came, a ledger that grew teeth while he slept. He had died before the collectors arrived, which Sela had decided to consider a mercy rather than a cowardice. It left her with nothing, no coin, no kin, no name worth speaking aloud, and so they had taken her instead, marked her register with the Omega seal, and given her a brush and a pail and a corner to sleep in behind the kitchen hearth. She told herself it was temporary. She had been telling herself that for 3 years. The hall was her favorite hour, not because it was pleasant, but because it was hers. No one watched her here. No one corrected her posture or sneered at the state of her dress. She could exist without performing her own diminishment, and that was the closest thing to freedom she had found inside these walls. She had copper-red hair, though she kept it plaited tightly back and tucked beneath a linen cap, so no one would notice. She had grey eyes the colour of river water in winter, storm-pale and quiet and very still, and a face that, had anyone bothered to look at it, they would have found startling. High cheekbones, a clean jaw, lips that curved even at rest into something that wasn't quite a smile, but suggested one was possible. She was small-framed and fine-boned beneath the shapeless servant's dress, and she carried herself with a stillness that read, to anyone who paid attention, less like submission and more like patience. No one paid attention. The first indication that the morning would not be ordinary came not as a sound, but as a change in the air. Sela felt it before she heard it, a pressure at the base of her skull, something animal and old, like the moment before lightning strikes. She had felt it before, faint and distant, in the 3 years she had lived inside these walls, a frequency she had no name for. She sat back on her heels and looked toward the far end of the hall. He stood in the archway. Leofric, Alpha King of Ashenmoor, Lord of the 7 Reaches, Sovereign of the Northern Teeth. He was tall enough that the torchlight caught the crown of his head before it reached the rest of him. Broad across the shoulder, narrow at the hip, dressed in his riding leathers because he had ridden through the night on court business and come home before the keep had woken to receive him. His hair was dark, almost black in the low light, and his eyes were gold. Not brown, not amber. Gold, the way certain birds of prey are gold, catching fire at angles that had no business existing in the hour before dawn. He stood in the archway and looked at the hall, not at her. Then his gaze moved, slow and unhurried, across the rushes, and stopped. Sela did not breathe. She had learned in 3 years that when powerful men noticed her, nothing good followed. She became very still, the brush motionless in her hand, and waited to be dismissed or corrected or sent somewhere else. He said nothing. After a long moment he turned and walked back through the arch, and the pressure in the air eased, and she breathed again. She told herself it was nothing. She was wrong. Lady Veldra had arrived at court in the autumn of Sela's first year, and she had never left. She was everything that the word beautiful was designed to describe. Tall and dark-haired and luminously pale, with eyes the colour of deep water and a mouth that smiled at precisely the right frequency to suggest warmth without feeling any. She was the daughter of the Lord of Crest Hollow, and she had positioned herself at Leofric's side within a season with a precision that left no room for accident. She was the king's chosen companion. In the court's language, that meant she would be queen. The selection, the ancient ceremony in which an alpha king confirmed his mate before court and council, had been pending for 2 years, held in abeyance by political complications. But everyone knew it was coming. Everyone knew who would be chosen. Veldra knew it especially. She ran the female servants with the efficiency of someone who had decided that cruelty was a management tool. She gave her corrections in public, because audiences were more instructive than privacy. She did not shout. She had learned that cold was more effective than heat, and she deployed it with the accuracy of a woman who had spent a long time practicing. Sela had been the focus of her attention since the 3rd week of her arrival. "You missed a section," Veldra said, her voice carrying across the great hall with the clarity of a bell. It was mid-morning. The hall was occupied, stewards moving between tables, 2 minor lords in conference near the fire, 3 ladies-in-waiting hovering at Veldra's shoulder. Sela was on her knees at the far end of the room, and she had not, in fact, missed a section. "My lady," she said, which was all she said. "Come here." Sela rose. She walked the length of the hall with her eyes down, and stopped 3 paces from Veldra and waited. "There," Veldra gestured toward the stretch of floor Sela had recently completed. "You can see the line where you stopped. It's obvious from here." There was no line, but arguing about the state of the floor with Veldra was an exercise in receiving a longer correction. "Do it again," Veldra said. "All of it, before the midday meal." "Yes, my lady. And remove that cap. You look like a peasant." Sela reached up and unpinned the linen cap, and held it in her hands. The copper-red braid tumbled free. Something moved at the edge of the room. Sela didn't look toward it. She had learned not to look toward things, but she felt it. That pressure at the base of her skull again, sudden and sharp as a needle pressed to skin. Veldra's expression changed. It was very slight, a fraction of a degree, and then it smoothed back into its habitual pleasantness. "Get back to work," she said. Sela pinned her cap back on and returned to the far end of the hall. The man who believed he owned her was named Gareth. He was Veldra's cousin, a connection that gave him just enough standing to be dangerous and not quite enough to be held accountable. He was broad and heavy-jawed, with hands like shovels and a habit of standing too close, and he had decided in the earliest weeks of Sela's arrival that the Omega debt slave with the river-grey eyes belonged to him in some way no document had ever confirmed. She avoided him with the discipline of someone who has mapped every back corridor and service passage in a keep and knows which ones have locking doors. She constructed her days around his movements, like a river roots itself around stone, always present, always flowing, never touching. For 3 years it had mostly worked. Then came the night of the council feast. The council feasts were the worst nights of Sela's calendar. The hall packed, the noise extraordinary, Gareth at his worst, after 2 hours of wine. She was assigned to the lower tables, carrying flagons and collecting empty trenchers, her cap pulled low, her eyes down, trying to be furniture. She had almost made it to the kitchens. Gareth stepped out from a side passage and caught her by the wrist. "I've been watching you all evening," he said. His breath was warm with wine. "You never look at me any more. Please," she said. "I have to get back to—" He yanked her into the passage. Her back hit the stone wall and the flagon hit the floor, and the sound of it clattering was swallowed entirely by the noise from the hall beyond. She could hear everything: voices, music, the ring of cups, and none of it could hear her. "I think it's time," he said, "that we had a conversation." She pressed her palms flat against the stone and said very clearly, "Let go of me." He laughed. He put his free hand against the wall beside her head. "You're an Omega, a debt slave. You don't tell anyone to let go of anything." She looked at him without flinching and said again, "Let go of me." Something flashed across his face. The expression of a man who has been denied a thing he had already decided was his. He tightened his grip on her wrist until the bones ground together, and Sela made no sound, because she had learned not to, and she thought, "This is going to end badly, and I don't know how to stop it." Then the temperature in the passage dropped. It happened the way weather happens, suddenly, perceptibly, from nowhere. The torch in the wall sconce shuddered. Gareth went very still. Sela watched his face change, watched the confidence drain out of it like water from a cracked vessel, leaving behind something she had never seen there before. Fear, real, physical, animal fear. "Let her go," said a voice from the archway. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. Gareth released her wrist and stepped back. He turned to face the archway, and whatever his face did next, Sela didn't see, because she had turned too, and she was looking at Leofric. The Alpha King stood in the entrance to the passage, with his arms at his sides and his gold eyes very still. He was not touching anything. He hadn't moved, but the air in that narrow stone corridor had the quality of a room where something enormous has decided to breathe in. "Your Majesty," Gareth said, trying to sound composed. He was failing. "I was only—" "Leave," said Leofric. One word, flat as a blade laid on a table. Gareth left. The passage was silent. Sela stood against the wall with her wrist held against her chest, her heart making a sound she could feel in her ears. "Are you hurt?" he said. She was so startled by the question that for a full second she didn't answer. "No, my wrist. It will bruise." He looked at her wrist. Then he looked at her face, and his expression was entirely unreadable. Not cold exactly, not warm, simply a kind of absolute attention she had not expected. "Return to your duties," he said. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said. She bent to collect the flagon from the floor, and when she straightened, he was already gone. She stood in the empty passage for a long moment and tried to understand what had just happened. Then she picked up the flagon and went back to work, because there was nothing else to do. The court physician's name was Aldous, and he was the only person in Ashenmoor who had ever called Sela by her name without making it sound like an insult. 3 days after the passage, he found her in the herb garden behind the east wing, sitting in the thin autumn sunlight on the low stone bench near the sage beds. She had come there on her rest hour. It was technically off limits to servants, but it was never monitored, and the bench was in full sun, and she had been using it in secret for 2 years. "Your wrist," Aldous said, settling beside her without preamble. He held out his hand. She held out her wrist. He examined it with careful fingers. The bruise had come up blue-black along the inner wrist, spreading toward her palm. He produced a small clay pot from his satchel and began to work a dark salve into the skin. "Sela," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly rather than carefully." She said nothing, which he took as permission. "Do you know what the selection is? The ceremony, when the king chooses his mate?" "Yes." He pressed the salve in gently. "The selection is not simply a ceremony. In the old law, the law that governed pacts before the courts were built, a mate bond is not chosen. It is recognized. The bond exists before either party is aware of it. It is chemical, biological, real. In the old law, a true mate bond cannot be faked. It cannot be assigned. It cannot be manufactured by proximity or politics. Sela watched the side of his face. "I'm telling you this," he said, "because I think you need to know it before things move faster than you are prepared for. I don't understand what this has to do with me." He looked at her then, directly, without the physician's practiced neutrality, and his eyes were very kind. "I know," he said. "I know you don't. That is what I'm afraid of." He closed the clay pot and pressed it into her hands. "Keep this. Apply it morning and evening. And Sela, be careful at the selection." He walked back toward the east wing door without looking back, and Sela sat in the autumn sun with the clay pot in her lap and felt the needle pressure at the base of her skull, faint and persistent, like a frequency she had been receiving her whole life without knowing it had a source. The selection was announced 3 days later. It would take place in the Great Hall before the full court and the Council of Lords on the last day of the autumn month. The proclamation was read by the King's Herald in the morning assembly, and the hall went very quiet, in the particular way it went quiet when something had been decided that everyone had been waiting for. Veldra received the news with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Sela received the news scrubbing the floor in the corner where she always was, invisible as smoke. The day of the selection, the great hall was dressed in the colours of Ashenmoor, black and deep amber, banners hung from the vault, candles by the 100 in iron stands, the court assembled in its finest. The lords of the 7 reaches stood in their formal order. The household staff were lined along the walls, present but peripheral, witnesses to the ceremony of power without being part of it. Sela stood at her station near the western wall, between a stone pillar and a wall sconce, and kept her eyes forward and her hands still. She did not look at the dais. She felt it when he entered. Leofric walked the full length of the hall in silence, the court parting for him without instruction, and the pressure at the base of her skull was not faint now. It was a sound almost, a low resonance that moved through her chest and settled there like something that had been looking for a place to land. She kept her eyes forward. She pressed her back against the pillar. The ceremony began. She heard the herald's words, the old language of pack law, the declaration of the selection, the summons of the candidate. And she heard Veldra's silk skirts move as she stepped forward from the Lord's tier, graceful and assured. Then Leofric spoke. His voice carried the hall without effort. He said the ritual words of the selection, the declaration of seeing, of recognition. Sela had never heard them spoken before. She heard them now, and something she could not name pressed against the inside of her chest, like a hand against glass. Veldra answered. The hall held its breath, and then Leofric stopped. It was not the silence of conclusion. It was the silence of interruption, of a process that had been proceeding normally suddenly encountering something that made it stop. The pressure in her skull spiked, sharp and unavoidable, and Sela closed her eyes for a moment and pressed her fingers against the stone pillar. When she opened them, Leofric was looking at her, directly at her. Across the full width of the hall, through the assembled court, past every person of rank and consequence, at her, at the Omega Det slave in the servant's dress, standing invisible against the western wall. His gold eyes were very bright. The court began to stir, a murmur, low and confused, spreading from the point where his gaze had stopped. Veldra turned her head, following his attention, and her face went perfectly, dangerously still. "Stop," said Leofric. The word was not addressed to anyone in particular. The entire hall stopped. He stepped down from the dais. He walked across the hall. Sela could not move. She had forgotten the careful art of invisibility, the tucked chin, the downcast gaze, the practiced smallness she had worn for 3 years like armor. She stood against the pillar and watched him coming toward her, and was entirely incapable of producing the appropriate performance of not being there. He stopped in front of her. The hall was absolutely silent. He was close enough that she could see the detail of the scar at his jaw. Old, silver against darker skin, the shape of something that had once been a blade wound. And his eyes in this proximity were not just gold but layered, amber at the center moving towards something almost green at the edge, and the pressure in her chest was not pressure anymore. It was recognition, like a name she had always known but never been given permission to speak. "Your name," he said. His voice was very quiet, only for her. "Sela," she said. Something moved across his face. Not surprise. Something older and more certain than surprise. "Sela," he said, as though testing the weight of it. Then, before the assembled court of 7 kingdoms, with every lord and lady and herald and servant watching in absolute silence, Leofric, Alpha King of Ashenmoor, said, "She is my mate." The hall exploded. What happened in the first minutes after that declaration was something Sela would piece together only later. What she registered was sensation. The noise of the court, like a physical force. Veldra's voice cutting through it, not screaming, too controlled for that, but sharp and clean and terrible. The movement of bodies as guards and courtiers realigned themselves along newly relevant fault lines. What she registered most clearly was Veldra reaching her before Leofric did. The Lady of Crest Hollow moved fast and purposefully, crossing the space with the efficiency of a person who has already decided what she is going to do. In her hand, Sela saw it half a second before it arrived, was the ceremonial pin she had worn at her collar, long and silver, needle-sharp at the tip. She drove it into Sela's upper arm. Sela made a sound, short, involuntary, and her hand came up to cover the wound, and the blood came fast, welling up through her fingers, bright against the servant's grey dress. She bled on the floor of the great hall of Ashenmoor, 3 drops, clear and vivid on the black stone, and Leofric, who had been moving toward her, not running, Alpha Kings do not run, stopped. He went very still, and then something happened to his face that the court would speak of afterward in low voices for years. A change so total it seemed less like an expression and more like a replacement, as though the controlled sovereign had simply ceased to exist, and something older and vastly less patient had taken his place. His eyes went from gold to something beyond gold, something that had no name in court vocabulary. His hands at his sides opened and closed once, a gesture of a man working very hard to remain in a form that no longer felt adequate. Then he moved, not toward Veldra, not yet, toward Sela. He reached her, and his hands, large, careful, entirely at odds with the expression on his face, took her injured arm with the gentleness of something that has decided tenderness is the only acceptable response. He looked at the wound. He looked at her face. His jaw was set very tight. Then he turned. Veldra stood 3 paces away, with the silver pin still in her hand, trying to maintain the composed expression that had served her for 2 years. But something at the edges of it was fraying, because Leofric was looking at her now with an attention she had never received from him before, and it was not the attention she had wanted. "You had one chance," he said, not loud, absolute. "Leofric," she began. "You touched my mate," he said. "You drew her blood, in this hall, before the full court." He said it the way you state a fact you are reading from a record, without inflection, without heat, which was worse than if he had shouted. Veldra's composure cracked. "She is nothing," she said, and the controlled voice came undone, the real thing visible beneath it for the first time, not the potential queen, but a woman who had built her entire existence on a foundation that had just been pulled out from beneath her and was terrified. "She is a debt slave, an omega," She doesn't even— She is my mate, Leofric said, and you have put your hands on her. He looked at his second, a pale-haired man who had appeared at his shoulder with the quiet competency of someone who has learned to anticipate his king. Corwin, the Lady of Crest Hollow will be escorted to her chambers. Her things will be inventoried. She will not leave the keep until I have spoken with her father. Yes, your majesty. Veldra did not go quietly. She went the way people go when they are more afraid than angry, but have decided anger is the more survivable presentation. Loudly, with words designed to wound, her chin up and her eyes bright. The guards walked her the length of the hall and out through the main doors, and the hall watched in the absolute silence of a court that has understood, collectively and instantly, that the world has just reorganized itself. Sela stood beside the man who had just claimed her before 7 kingdoms, and tried to understand how she had arrived at this moment from scrubbing the floor in the hour before dawn. She was bleeding through her fingers. The hall was very large. She was very small. Leofric, Alpha King of Ashenmoor, was looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a room that was otherwise in motion. "You're still bleeding," he said. "Yes," she said. Then, because she could not think of anything else, "I'm sorry about the floor." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, before the full court, before 7 lords and their retinues and every herald and servant and courtier in the hall, Leofric, Alpha King of Ashenmoor, went to one knee in front of her. One knee, on the stone floor, before an Omega debt slave with copper-red hair and river-grey eyes, and a face that had been beautiful for 3 years, while no one had the grace to notice. The hall made a sound, 200 people encountering something they had not believed was possible, producing a collective intake of breath that was very nearly one voice. Leofric, on one knee, said quietly, "Only for her, even in this room, even at this volume, there is nothing to apologize for." He took her free hand in both of his, with the careful, absolute deliberateness of a man making a vow. "This will not happen to you again. I give you my word." Sela looked at him, at the gold eyes, at the scar at his jaw, at the expression that was not performance and not politics, but something raw and older and entirely real. And she understood, at last, what Aldous had been trying to tell her in the herb garden. Not chosen, recognized. The mate bond did not ask. It simply was. She said, very quietly, "I believe you." Aldous came to the chamber they had given her, a real chamber, with a real fire and an actual bed, and cleaned and dressed the wound with the same unhurried care he gave everything. When he had finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at her with his physician's eyes, and then with something older. "Your bloodline," he said. "Your mother's line. I have been reading the old pack records in the Keep Library. Pre-court, pack era. The Omega designation assigned to you at intake is a legal category, not a biological one. The biological record is different." He paused. "Your mother's bloodline carries the silver trait." She knew what the silver trait was. Everyone did, the way everyone knows the name of something legendary. "That's not possible," she said. "It is the only thing that explains what I have observed about you that does not fit the Omega classification. The way you receive the bond frequency, the way you affect the King's alpha response." He looked at her steadily. "You are not what this court has been telling you that you are." She sat for a long time after he left, looking at the flames in the unfamiliar hearth, thinking about a man who had gone to his knees on the stone floor of his own great hall. Not because she had asked him to, because he couldn't do anything else. What happened to Gareth was not violent. It was something close to it, in the way that certainty can be something close to violence without quite crossing the line. Leofric summoned him to his private council chamber 2 days after the selection. Corwin was present. The keep's legal recorder was present. The document Gareth was shown, a precise accounting of 3 years of incidents, compiled in Corwin's careful hand at the king's instruction, was longer than anything Gareth had imagined anyone had been paying attention to. He left the keep before the week was out. Veldra's father arrived within the fortnight. The audience with Leofric lasted 1 hour. The Lord of Crest Hollow departed the next morning, and Veldra departed with him, and the terms, a withdrawal from court, a relinquishment of all claims, a permanent removal from the 7 Reaches, were sealed and witnessed before they cleared the gate. Sela did not watch her go. She was in the library, learning to read the old pack records by firelight. The weeks that followed were not easy, in the way that rebuilding is never easy. There were lords who had questions. There were courtiers who had spent years learning Veldra's opinions as their own. There were diplomatic letters and legal proceedings, and the daily business of a kingdom that did not pause for its king's personal reckoning. Leofric handled all of it with the same quality he brought to everything. Not warmth, not yet, but an absolute certainty that communicated itself to the court without requiring him to raise his voice. He was with her in the evenings, not spectacularly, not with declarations or ceremony. He came to the library where she was reading, or to the small solar where she had discovered a view of the eastern mountains that caught the last light in a way she found necessary, and he sat nearby, and he was there. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the opposite of everything she had been for 3 years. She was not invisible anymore. One evening, with the fire low and the library quiet around them, she set down the record she had been reading and looked at him across the table. "I'm sorry," she said, "for not knowing. About the bond." He looked up from his report with the steadiness he seemed to bring to her specifically. "You had no reason to know," he said. "The information was kept from you." "Still," she said, 3 years. "I knew for 6 months," he said, "and I spent them fighting it, because what I thought I knew about the shape of my life was wrong, and that was easier to keep than to correct." He set the report down. "I owe you 6 months." She thought about the hour before dawn, the empty hall, the invisible girl with the brush and the pail. "We'll count differently going forward," she said. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile. He didn't seem built for easy smiling, and she found she didn't need him to be. But something warmer than his usual careful control. A thaw, a first sign of what was underneath. "Yes," he said, "we will." On the day of the formal recognition, the ceremony before court and council, in which an Alpha King's confirmed mate was presented to the 7 Reaches, Sela stood in the great hall again, not at the western wall, not with her eyes down, and her cap low, and her hands arranged in the careful performance of not being there. She stood on the dais. She wore the colours of Ashenmoor, deep amber against black, a gown of embroidered wool with a silver clasp at the collar, and her copper-red hair loose down her back, the way it looked in the morning light when she had forgotten to be small. The grey eyes that had always been beautiful, even when no one looked at them, moved over the assembled court without apology. She stood with the stillness that had always been there, not submission, not smallness, but patience. And now it read for exactly what it was. She was waiting to begin. Leofric stood beside her. When the herald finished the declaration of recognition, he turned to look at her, and his gold eyes had the quality she was beginning to know, certain, absolute, entirely for her. The court knelt, 200 people, lords and ladies and courtiers and servants and guards, the assembled weight of 7 kingdoms, going to their knees on the black stone floor. Sela stood on the dais and looked out at the room and let herself believe, for the first time in 3 years, that she was here. Not temporary, not hiding, not trying to be furniture. Here. The girl who had scrubbed this floor before dawn, who had breathed through her mouth to bear the smell of it, who had kept her cap low and her eyes lower. She was here, and she was seen, and the hall she had cleaned 100 times in the dark was now full of light. Leofric, very quietly, only for her, said, "Ready?" She looked at him, at the scar, at the gold eyes, at the man who had gone to one knee on this same floor because he couldn't do anything else. "Yes," she said. She had never, in her life, meant anything more completely. Narrator to audience. She bled on his floor, and he lost his mind. And this kingdom, ancient and proud, and entirely certain of the way things were done, watched its king kneel for a girl who had been scrubbing its stones for 3 years, and never once believed she was worth being seen. She was always worth being seen. Tell me, if you were Sela, after 3 years of being invisible in those halls, could you have trusted it? Could you have let yourself believe it was real? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, hit that like button, make sure to subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Stories like this one come out every week, and I don't want you to miss what's coming next. Until next time.